international online seminar series. For those that haven't yet attended, I think I saw a couple of people that I haven't seen before log in. Um, just to give a brief description and overview of what this seminar series is, so and what the GEPIC project is. So the GEPIC project is an international project that's looking to improve the confidence of disadvantaged girls to engage in politics, right? In other words, political self-efficacy, right? It's a multi-stage project we're in sort of phase 2 right now. But phase 1 was to do observations across all the different participating classrooms in the schools and in the countries of the project. There are 6 countries involved in the project. There's Belgium, Czech Republic, Denmark, Germany, Spain, and the UK. And across all these 6 countries, we're engaging in different portions and different phases of the project, but ultimately we all will be developing an intervention that goes into classes, and the pilot of that will be launched in April of next year. And then the full intervention, which we will refine and scale up to be in schools in all of these different countries in January, starting hopefully January 2025, if everything goes according to the schedule. So the idea is that for this seminar series is because we take an intersectional perspective on this gender disparity of confidence to engage in politics. It's without saying it's a very complex project. There's many aspects to it, and so we wanted to start this seminar series to invite key researchers and teachers and just key stakeholders essentially that are involved that can give us input on how to operationalize and how to take ways to think about different approaches to this project. So it's not just it's knowledge exchange, but it's also it's actually helping us to make decisions of how we proceed in the project, and specifically with the content of how we and how we approach it within the project. And so today we have a really special visit from 2 of our team members within the consortium who have worked on a systemic review of literature, and that's putting it kind of sort of mildly. It's a massive undertaking with what they've done. It's fantastic. They've covered so many different topics, which they'll talk about today. And so the systemic review was a review on inequalities in political interest and political efficacy, and it's for the GEPIC project specifically, and to help us sort of get through all of the different stages of the project. And so we have to present this, some of the findings and the work that they've done are Dr. Philipp Kleer from, he's a postdoctoral researcher from JLU, and we have Irene Arahal Moreno from a doctoral student from, or the postdoctoral, or sorry, a doctoral researcher from Royal Holloway University and here in the UK. So yes, so I just want to say hello to everyone and welcome you all, and I'll give the floor to our wonderful speakers.
Lenora, can you give me the permission so that I can share the slides?
You should have permission. I've given, you do not. I've thought I've given that. I have permission for all attendees to present. Could you email it to me as a backup while I make sure?
Now it's possible.
Lenora, I've just done it. It's okay.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I should have been all attendees have the access.
And now you should see it, probably.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so hi everybody. Thanks Lenora for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. So yeah, Phil and I will go through the work that we did as part of the second work package of the GEPIC project. And basically the question that we were trying to assess was, well, we wanted to find the gender gap and gender differences in political engagement, looking at it from an intersectional perspective, to serve as the basis for the rest of the GEPIC project. And so first I will go through why, basically the motivation behind this research, this systematic approach to the topic. Then Phil will go through how we did it, what the method was to get to the final bulk of the papers that we ended up analyzing. And then again, he will go through one of the ways we decided to measure political engagement, which is through differences in political interests. I will do a section on political efficacy, and then we will conclude and see how we can keep building the research in this direction. Yeah. You can skip that one. Okay, so first, as to why we decided to undertake this task. The question guiding our research was, do women just not engage in politics, as intuition, but also previous research seems to point at? And if you can skip to that one, to the next one. Okay. We tend to find throughout the papers that very similar citations that tend to say that women engaged less in politics. We wanted to find how generalizable those findings were, and both for political interest and political efficacy, and also, as GEPIC and Lenora has just said, looks at this from an intersectional perspective. We wanted to tackle the question, well, how intersectional is this effect? Is it only gender, or are there any other socio-structural characteristics that women possess or can possess that are lowering their political engagement abilities, such as age, being part of a lower economic class, being part of an ethnic or racial minority. So we were trying to look at that. And of course, it is always nice to have a systematic approach to what already exists in the literature, and this to serve as a basis for the rest of the GEPIC project, and then to design the interventions for the non-exploratory phases of the project. You can go.
Okay, and I just want to highlight out what we've done and what a systematic literature review is, and in order also to address the limitations of what we done, to have clear in mind what our results can say and what not. So when we look at studies, we have all existing studies on political engagement worldwide represented by these different papers. But then, because we did this in a systematic approach and not in a subjective state of art, we just did not pick stuff we read or we like. We approached it by two major databases. However, these databases have some lags. So some of the studies that might be existing might not be findable by the databases itself. We used Web of Science and Scopus. And then for the search, we used a specific search string. And due to that specific combination of words with Boolean operators, also some of the studies that exist might not be findable anymore. So we, at the end, this is still in a systematic approach, but it has limitations because some of the studies might not be findable due to search string or to database. And what we then did with the remaining studies was trying to find structures between studies in terms of measurement, operationalization of the concepts, or even on structures on the results of the effect. We can go back to the search string if you have questions about it in the discussion. I think I just want to highlight that we used Web of Science and searched in title, abstract, topic, authors keyword. And for Scopus, we were able to search in title, abstract, and keywords. We searched and filtered between March and May. Before we start with the whole sample, we did a reliability test with 40 randomly chosen entries. And between all the coders pairs, and between all three coders, we got acceptable and sufficient reliability couples for our search. Nonetheless, we, even after the reliability, we discussed some of the inclusion and exclusion criteria to make it even more coherent between coders for the final approach to filtering the entries. What we then did with the overall entries was, the first thing was data manipulation. So we sorted out double entries, abstract only papers, books, and also non-English paper. With the remaining studies, we did a screening by title and abstract regarding to the exclusion-inclusion criteria. And then with the remaining, we went into the full text of each of the studies. And with the remaining, we started sorting them by definitions and operationalization of the dependent variable. How we did this grouping, we will address in each of the sections. And then as a final step, we did vote counting and introduced by Gaze. So we didn't do a meta-analysis of the effect to get like the overall effect, direction, and size, because most of the models differed largely in which kind of variables that included. Sometimes they also didn't do regressions. They did different methods like structural equation models. So we opted against meta-analysis because we thought it's not possible to go for meta-analysis because of the different methods and also the huge variation on samples. So we did vote counting, and what this means is we counted in which direction is the effect, negative, positive, is it significant or not? And by this, we summarize the results of the studies. So for interest, we had around 900 studies we started with during the process. After title and abstract, we had around 700 studies left. After full text analysis, or before full text, we had 95, and after full text, we remained with 66 studies in this process. For efficacy, it was a bit less. It was around 450 studies in the beginning. After data manipulation, it was around 300. After title and abstract screening, it was around 100. And after full text, there were 64 studies left that we went through and analyzed in the systematic literature review. So we have limitations, as I pointed out, because we just use 2 databases, but nonetheless, potentially they have a wide variety of research worldwide, and they both represent 2 large academic databases that exist. As I also pointed out before, due to our search string and the aim of finding especially intersectional studies and the end and or operators in the search string, we might left out studies that didn't address this in the keywords, in the title, in the abstract, because maybe for that studies it was only control variables that haven't had any highlight in the text we filtered by the databases. We restricted the studies to be published in English in order that all team members can assess the studies. However, like Web of Science and Scopus are lean to English publications. There were only, I think, less than 10 studies or 20 studies, like 10 in each section in a different language. So it was not a huge amount of studies that we left out due to this limitation. What we also did not do, mostly because of time issues, we didn't do any forward or backward search from highly cited papers. So this sometimes is done by others when they do systematic literature approach, but we skipped this step due to time issues. And now I will talk a bit about the findings on political interest. So if we sum up all the studies, so you see clearly in the graph in the last row that for gender, most of the studies indeed show a negative significant effect. You will see this graph in the following slides, also for efficacy all the time. On the left side, you have the 4 variables of interest for age, income, education, and gender. And on the right side, you see the frequency, the missing cases. So for gender, it was like 24 studies that didn't include a measurement on gender. However, what I will point out in the following is it really depends how respondents were asked about political interest in order to have a negative significant effect. As I pointed out, we categorized the studies by the operationalization and conceptualization of the dependent variable. So most of the studies did use a general item of political interest, as it is used in most larger social surveys like European Social Survey, European Values Studies. It's like 32 studies out of the 62. Then we have, unfortunately, only 10 studies, but I think these are the most interesting studies in this group because they measure different levels, like local, state, federal, international, sometimes EU level also. And then we have, it was a bit of a residual category for us because there exists like 24 out of the 66 studies that mix the cognitive attitude of interest in an index with variables on behavior, like news use, discussion frequency, media consumption. They mixed it sometimes with feelings about learning, feelings about how much joy you feel about following politics, or even other affective attitudes. So it's not, they did not only measure this cognitive attitude of political interest, they included in an index with other items that might lead to different directions when we look at the results. For publication years, we can clearly see that the interest in political interest as a dependent variable rose in the recent years. So in the last, like most of the studies in the systematic literature review were published in the last 6 to 7 years. When we now look at the first category, the general political interest, and the header is more or less a phrasing of how it is asked in surveys, we clearly see when we look at gender that most of the studies showed or indicated a negative effect for women, even among samples from youth, like in the study of Burkowska and Lutra. It was a panel from 60-year-old onwards in the UK. Sikognani showed it with among students 15 to 19 in Belgium, and Omer also showed it from Danish students from age 15. There was one study that indicated a positive effect of gender on political interest. However, it's a special sampling. It was an online sampling, so that might also lead to the proportion of people interested taking rather part in this in terms of the other studies that did some randomization. We see a clear positive effect of higher education, although 31% of the study missed any variable of education. To a less extent, we see it for age and income. However, like most studies, did not include measurements for income or age in the studies. For an intersectional approach, the first study in this category that indicated an interaction between age and gender. So Friley and Gomes showed that throughout the lifespans, female express less interest. In the same way, the study of Carante and Dottisani showed that, however, they focused more on marital status and having children. And interestingly, they showed that for women, being in a marriage and having a child at home leads to the largest gender gap throughout the lifespans compared to men. However, men always, throughout every lifespan and throughout every category of marital status, showed higher political interest. A second study pointed out that some of the effects from gender to political interest is mediated through self-confidence, and lower self-confidence in this study was attributed to being female, African American, and interestingly having higher education in this combination. And the last study that in this group of study had an intersectional approach was a study of Ray Lake and al. They looked at the transition of adulthood, so the sample was aged between 18 to 30, and they used cross-sequential samples from 28 cohorts from the 70s to the early 2000s. And with this sample, they showed that Black women exhibited higher political interest than Black men. It's partly also true for Latinos. However, it was not significant, but the direction was positive for Latinas compared to Latinos. However, and it's important to notion, Black and Latino women always showed less political interest than white women. So that's always need to be taken in mind. In the second category, the category of mixed different levels, we clearly see, okay, the direction is not so straightforward as it is with the general political interest. We have 4 out of 10 studies that used an index. The other ones had single models for each level. And we see some studies show the clear effect of gender, as it was shown in general interest. For example, there's a study from Stadelmann, Stefan, and Sulze from Swiss students. They measured 4 different levels. However, 2 of the levels were national and general political interest. So half of the index leads to general political interest, because national and general are highly correlated, around 0.8 to 0.9 usually. So it's not so surprising that they found, even with this index measuring cantonal, and so it's state or local interest, a significant gender gap. We see mixed effects for education also. However, lower levels mostly negatively connected to political interest in most studies. And we see some positive effects for age. In this group, 2 studies stand out. And the first one is Thomas and Verge, because they had an experimental setting. And in the first setting, they had 2 items, a general item and an item on specific topics. And respondents needed to show how much they are interested on both of the items. And in the first experiment, in this approach, they showed that men significantly showed higher political interest than women when the general political interest item was asked first. When it was asked second, the gender gap between men and women decreased by nearly 2/3 and also turned into an insignificant effect. What they interestingly showed in this first experiment setting was that women always showed significantly more political interest when asked on the topic item, regardless of the position, and compared to male. And in a second experiment, they had a battery of female and male-oriented items and a mixed item category. Surprisingly, they showed in that experiment that men expressed across all the combined subsamples for female, male, or mixed oriented political interest, higher levels of political interest, but it was only significantly higher when asked about male-oriented topics. So this is also a study that indicates that how we ask about political interest matters largely for the size of the effect or the direction. And there's another study that's interesting that was done by Sanchez Vitores, because they included interactions among gender, marital status, and care work. And they showed in their sample that even with these interactions, that women still have higher probability in indicating not very or not at all interested on 3 different levels: on a general, on a national, and on a local level. And what they also showed, that care itself does not significantly influence the gender gap amongst the marital status categories. However, here again, as compared to the study of Carante, individuals who had never been married or involved in a stable union showed the smallest gender gaps. So the difference to men was smaller for women being not involved in a stable union or have never been married. And then we have our last category with the mixed indices. As I said, they mix the cognitive attitude with behavior or affective attitudes. As you can see on the right side of the graph, most studies did not include the factors we saw that might be relevant looking at. However, we could see here again that some studies indicated a negative significant effect. For use, it's a study of Seklowitz and Santonella, 2 studies from Oberle, and a study from Allosi. And one of the outstanding studies in this group is a study again from Wolak, who now mediated the gender effect via conflict-seeking orientations. And women expressed less conflict-seeking orientations, and gender exhibited a negative indirect effect through this conflict-seeking orientation on all the 4 dimensions they indicated for political interest. But they also showed that the direct and negative significant effect of gender, including this mediation, stays only significant for the dimensions of having attention to politics and enjoying political discussion. So part of the gender effect in their measurement on political interest was mediated through these conflict-seeking orientations. And the study of Alosi also is very interesting because it showed that it included interactions between gender and the frequency of classroom discussions, and also an interaction of gender and grade. And it also, instead of having dummy variables for races, it also included different or separate regressions for each race category. In this study, it was white, black, Asian American, Hispanic, and Native American, and the sample was from the US. And overall, they showed that non-white and male respondents showed significantly less interest than white and female respondents. So here, the gender effect overall was positive. However, when we look at the models for Asian Americans and Hispanics, once they introduced the interaction effects of frequency of classroom discussions and grade, the effect for Asian Americans as Hispanics, the gender effect turns insignificant. And for Black respondents, it's even more interesting. Once they included the interactions, the positive significant effect of being female among Black respondents turned insignificant and also turned direction to the negative side. So this is an overview what we did in the political interest part, and now Irene will follow with the efficacy part.
Yeah, now onto the efficacy part, which was, well, political efficacy was the second variable that we chose to measure political engagement. And here on the graph, you have an overview of all the studies that made it to the last part of the analysis. And just like in political interest, but this time a little bit more, it really depends. Like the effects of gender on political efficacy really depend on what type of efficacy we're talking about. And so if you go to the next slide, the first task that we had to tackle, and this was very labor intensive, and Gemma can talk about it, was classifying political efficacy, because we were a team of 6 political scientists, and for us, political efficacy has 2 very distinct dimensions that are prevalent since the 60s. We have internal political efficacy on the one hand and external political efficacy on the other hand. Internal political efficacy, referred to as political self-efficacy in other disciplines close tied to psychology, but also education sciences, refers to the self-perceived ability that one has to understand politics, to engage in political activities, to engage in political discussions, versus external political efficacy, which refers to the perception that we have that the government and the political systems are responsive to our demands and needs as citizens. And so in our studies, we found a very large variation of instruments to capture political efficacy, either of those dimensions. We found very different items in the different questionnaires. We found very different ways of constructing indexes, some of them tested through factor analysis, some of them not. And a good bunch of studies which used a similar measurement coming either from the American National Elections study, from the ICCS, European Social Survey. Those studies were fairly easier to classify. But then with the rest of the studies, 2 coders had to review the instruments that each of the study had used and classify each of the studies into whether they were looking at an internal dimension of political efficacy, an external dimension of political efficacy, if they were looking at both through different instruments, or if they were looking at indexes that had been constructed mixed in the two dimensions. And this, in general, it was a classification that worked, except for some of the studies included that made it into the last cut. For example, with this was this caused some discussions. There were a couple papers by Grutter which phrased political efficacy or asked for political efficacy in surveys as if things should change, one needs to personally act rather than relying on politics. And we could not agree on whether this was measuring an internal dimension of political efficacy or an external dimension, or if it was measuring political efficacy at all. And so we had to drop those papers out of the study. If you can go to the next slide. But in the end, we started from 64 different studies. 17 of them measured an internal dimension of political efficacy. 16 of them only measured external elements of political efficacy. 20 of them looked at both dimensions separately. So that was easier to classify. And then we have a category of 11 papers that mixed in the same index elements that belong to both internal and external dimensions of efficacy, which is problematic because, of course, results are no longer generalizable if you look at efficacy in a mixed way. And looking at when the studies were published, just as in political interest, there has been an upward trend in the interest of the scientific community in political efficacy. And so most of the papers that we have were written in the past 10 years. Now to the results, the internal dimension of political efficacy, in this case, there was a very clear effect of being a woman on the reported ability to understand and participate in politics. Out of the studies that included gender as a covariate, almost all of them found significant negative effects. And in the ones that didn't find significant negative effects, some results were mixed, and only a couple papers showed positive but still non-significant effects. With the rest of the sociodemographic covariates, the trend is very similar. Also, very age, income, and education all seem to significantly define political efficacy, although we need to be cautious because not in all papers these covariates were included or reported. But still, the patterns are very much there. Looking particularly at youth, we found, and this is quite relevant for the goals of the GEPIC research group, that girls as young as 12 or 13 already express less political efficacy than boys of the same age. And only one of the studies that looked at youth showed mixed results. Particularly, this study referred to 3 different countries. It looked at schools and it compared the efficacy of students in academic and vocational school tracks. And so they found that girls expressed more political efficacy than boys in Denmark and Germany, but not in England. And if you go to the next slide, we can go on to external political efficacy. And here, patterns are very much not existent. Only education and much less clearly income show a positive relation with external political efficacy, meaning that the more educated individuals are and the higher the class that they belong to, the more they feel that governments and political systems are sensitive to their needs. However, in the case of age and gender, there is no pattern. Results are mixed or very much insignificant. In the case of gender, only 7 of the studies that were included in the last cut show significant coefficients, 5 of them negative, meaning that, well, as we would have expected, being a woman indicates lower levels of external political efficacy, and 2 positive. But the truth is that for both gender and age, results are very mixed. and there is no clear conclusion to be taken out of here, except for it's maybe good to clarify that this doesn't really go against what we would have expected for external political efficacy. If we remember when we defined it, external political efficacy refers to responsiveness that you feel that the government has. And so this variable has been very related to political trust and to supporting the government, like having voted for the government, not so much to any socio-structural demographic variable. So this doesn't really mess up research or anything like that. And now into the summary.
Yeah, so what we now want to do is like do some summary in terms of like what could future research look out for, and also what does it mean for the JAPIC project for the following steps. And for political interest, like we see that there exists a gender gap, especially when asked about this general political interest among different measurements, countries, or years. However, we also seen, especially by these two studies of Ferrin and Thomas and Berge, that the understanding of the term politics seems to matter a lot when we assess political interest. And I think what we can take out of that, for especially for education and also for the intervention, that relating different areas of politics to the term politics and maybe changing the significance of the meaning of politics, because now it seems to be this general word seems to be related mostly for women to male-oriented topics. And so once they are introduced with broader ideas, they express also more interest. And secondly, most of the studies did not assess any intersectional effects. And that was for us a bit surprising, because we thought like, okay, this is like really in recent years something that is like highlighted in a lot of studies, but it wasn't consistently shown in many studies in the literature review. Some of them showed higher political interest of girls from disadvantaged groups compared to the male parts of the counterparts of this group. Some did show as like Alozi that the frequency of political talks might decrease gender effects, although it was a positive gender effect for female in these racial subgroups. But others also showed, like compared in age cohort, that there's a consistent gender gap across age cohort. So I think for research, we can summarize up, and this is also interesting because we aim at this, especially in the ongoing part of work package 2, to use data sets and exploring more in depth and more comprehensively and also empirically, maybe more sophisticated, how we can construct intersectional effects and what we get out of these intersectional effects.
And for the case of political efficacy, really quickly, we found that the gender gap is very much existent for girls, but also people belonging to lower classes, having lower levels of education, and younger people across, and this has been found for internal political efficacy across very different methods and across different sampling techniques. So that is a good starting point for the rest of the project. And but of course, the generalization of these results should be done very cautiously, because there is generally no unity in the way that political efficacy is measured. Sometimes some papers didn't even talk about the dimension of political efficacy that they were referring to. So using terms like this can be very misleading. And again, like in political interest, there is a very clear lack of an intersectional perspective to approach efficacy in general. Of course, well, we couldn't find any studies that looked at intersectionality from an interactive perspective, and what we have was studies that looked at very specific subsamples of the population, thus making any comparison with larger social groups almost impossible. Like Rowe et al. Looked at young and ethnic minorities, but of course, you cannot compare it to the general population. And Woloch also looked at white and non-white women, finding that political efficacy was lower in non-white women, but there's no way of comparing those results to men or the general population. And so I
Yeah,
think that's
so
it.
thank you very much for your attention, and we are looking forward to answer and have a discussion now about this literature review and the results of it.
Thank you both so much. I will stop the recording so we can have an open discussion and Q&A. And so for everyone that's watching later, thank you so much. See you later.